To say that US torpedoes at the start of the US's involvement in World War II had issues is putting it mildly. But at times it can get a little bit confusing to try and remember which torpedoes had which problems and roughly how long it took to fix them. It also needs to be stressed that US submarines, aircraft and surface ships all used different torpedoes. And while some problems were related, each weapon also needed different measures to fix their problems. Now, I'd also point out at this stage, before you start furiously typing, that yes, the US did have other torpedoes in service. It had older ones, such as the Mark 10s that could be found on the old S-class submarines, and during the war, more torpedoes would be introduced, like the electric Mark 18, which had a raft of its own problems. But for the moment, we're going to concentrate on what was counting for the latest and greatest torpedoes in the US military in 1941, the Mark 13, the Mark 14, and the Mark 15. So, let's take a look at each of them in turn, going in numerical order. First, we have the Mark 13. So, for a bit of background, the Mark 13 was a bit of an odd weapon in the grand scheme of things. The US Navy had started its journey with aerial torpedoes by adopting the Mark 7, a 17.7-inch Bliss-Leavitt weapon, which had been issued to the US Navy just before World War I and was originally designed for use in submarines and destroyers. Although using a submarine or destroyer torpedo was the starting point for most navies, the Mark 7 in particular proved quite unsuitable for air launch. First, they tried lowering the torpedoes down to the water by a cable. This tended to just rip off the tails as soon as they struck the waves. And so they went with a more normal approach of dropping them from an underslung mounting on an aircraft. But while the Mark 7 had great strength along its long axis to survive the acceleration of being chucked out a torpedo tube, it turned out to be quite weak when subjected to perpendicular forces and thus tended to break up on hitting the water. This was further compounded by the balance of the various components inside it, making it quite unstable in flight, which made it almost impossible to guarantee an optimal angle of entry into the water. This, in turn, meant that US torpedo bombers found themselves flying at less than a wingspan above the water and at just above stalling speed, just to make sure the weapons actually went into the water with a half-decent chance of working. Efforts were made to solve these issues, but generally they ended up working against each other. Strengthening being applied to the body to help it withstand impact, being almost entirely counteracted by a nose attachment that was designed to help stabilize the thing in flight, but which also ended up concentrating stress on a fixed portion of the torpedo body, which overcame the strengthening. Efforts were soon made to develop a dedicated air-dropped torpedo, but these were quickly shelved when other officers promised that it would be faster and cheaper to make still further adaptations to the Mark 7, which they promised would work. Spoiler alert, they did not, in fact, work. Although the Mark 7 could, by the end of the 1920s, now be dropped from the heady height of 65 feet, and at speeds that could actually be measured in three-digit numbers, if only just, by the turn of the 1920s to the 1930s, it was clear that a new weapon would be needed. And so began the protracted development of the Mark 13, which would then take up most of the following decade. Unlike everybody else, who'd stuck with a relatively long 18-inch diameter torpedo as the airborne weapon of choice, the Mark 13 ended up coming out almost 22.5 inches, wider than almost any submarine or surface-launched torpedo, maintaining a weight which could be lifted into the air by aircraft of the period by cutting down on length. At just over 13 feet long, it was considerably shorter than most foreign aerial-borne torpedoes, its greater girth serving to further emphasize this when you look at photos. The width was partly to allow a larger warhead to be carried up front, as the US Navy was quite obsessed with having the biggest possible boom in its torpedoes. After about 8 years in development, the Mark 13 finally began to deploy across the fleet in 1938. In terms of specification, in its initial in-service form, the Mark 13 weighed just under 2,000 pounds, measured just a fraction under 13.5 feet long, and carried a warhead of about 400 pounds of TNT. although later versions would get fractionally longer and heavier, mostly in aid of adding about 50% more explosive by weight and then switching out to the more powerful Torpex. It was introduced in 1938, but it took some time to build up stocks, with US carrier torpedo bomber squadrons only having 2 torpedoes per torpedo bomber until the start of the 1940s. Unlike its submarine-launched relative, these stock levels were somewhat hampered by actual testing and exercises, although the lessons of these exercises were either ignored or not acted on quickly enough. But the exercises tended to expend a fairly large number of torpedoes due to, well, there being a fairly large number of aircraft dropping them. And that brings us on to its problems. Now, the list of problems with the Mark 13 ended up being the most extensive of all 3 torpedo types under discussion here, if you can believe that. The rudders loved to turn left and would therefore send the torpedoes in great arcs rather than straight lines. When they did go where you wanted them to, they'd often head off into the depths as if they'd received a mission to hunt Davy Jones himself, or else they'd become so overcome with exuberance at the prospect of destroying the enemy that they'd leap from the seas like dolphins. And all of this assumed they'd even gotten into the sea in one piece in the first place, as although designed for higher speed launches, it was found that trying to drop them at the speed specified in the manual often ended up in ripping off the propellers. And the power of the airflow had a disturbing tendency to also arm the detonator mid-flight during a drop, so it wasn't unheard of for a Mark 13 to just explode on contact as soon as it hit the water. Yet another problem was that the relatively short, fat nature of the weapon tended to make it wobble in flight and thus hit the water at a variety of interesting angles, which would twist and shear control rods and gears which had been strengthened against the expected axis of shock, but not these new and interesting ones. Very occasionally, the stars would align and a set of drops by very careful pilots would actually go well, but this was the exception rather than the rule. One thing that did work, assuming that it didn't arm itself a bit too early, was the detonator, or the exploder in US Navy parlance, as the Mark 13 used its own bespoke contact-only model, which was entirely separate from the infamous Mark 6 exploder found in the Mark 14 and 15, which we'll come to in a minute. Still, even by mid-1943, when both sides in the Pacific were taking a little bit of a breather from large-scale carrier battles, a study was done of 105 Mark 13 torpedo drops that had been carried out at a reasonable clip. These showed that 36% of these torpedoes just flat out refused to start their motor or had stripped their propellers, so the net effect was the same, they didn't go anywhere. 20% headed off to blow up some portion of the seabed. Another 20% ran around in little circles. 18% dipped and rose as if they were on a roller coaster. 2% took up surfing across the surface. And less than a third, 31% to be precise, actually went where you wanted them to go. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might recognise that all those figures add up to well over 100%, but that's because quite a few of the torpedoes showed more than one of the above-mentioned faults. So, what were the solutions? The Mark 13's issues were obviously not the fault of the pilots. So many drops from so many different pilots in so many different circumstances from several types of aircraft made it quite impossible to blame them all. And so fixing the problems was made a priority. The issue was that there were so many problems. Changes to the shape of the torpedo itself in various places had little effect, and it was quickly appreciated that the single biggest problem was the torpedo's instability in the air. If you fixed that, many of the other issues might solve or at least partially solve themselves. Some suggested strapping small wings to the torpedoes, effectively making them glide torpedoes. But while this would technically work, exactly where the wings had to go and what size and shape they needed to be would vary depending on what aircraft was carrying the torpedo, whether it was being carried internally or externally, and what speed and altitude and thus attack profile the aircraft was using. And so it just really wasn't a viable solution unless you forced absolutely everybody to attack in exactly the same manner, regardless of circumstances. The other option, flying really, really low and really, really slow, was understandably unpopular with pilots who would have to do so in the face of some rather enthusiastic anti-aircraft gunners aboard their targets. By the end of 1942, the decision was taken to try to both fix the Mark 13 and, in parallel, develop a whole new airdrop torpedo, just in case it proved unfixable. However, towards the end of the following year, the improvement program finally struck gold. Minor changes to the propeller design helped to fix the snapping off issues, but the big innovation was the installation of a plywood cylinder that was stuck on the nose, along with a box-shaped stabilizer applied to the back end, plus a metal shroud ring that was fitted around the propellers. The two wooden components massively stabilized the torpedo in flight, and also significantly increased drag, which helped to slow it down. Furthermore, when the torpedo eventually hit the water, the force of the impact, of course, shattered and tore off the plywood components, but this served as a further set of shock absorbers, which helped to preserve the Mark 13 itself. So successful was this element of the fix that not only could the Mark 13 now be dropped at the speed and altitude that had originally been planned for it, it was found that it could be dropped from considerably greater heights and speeds than any other aerial torpedo in service. The long glide path that the stabilizer gave it even meant that the distance from the target could be increased as well, particularly when coupled with the increased launch speed. This massively increased the survivability of the torpedo bombers, as well as improving the performance of the torpedo. An Avenger, for example, could now drop a torpedo from just under 1,000 feet at full throttle, and these figures climbed as faster and more capable torpedo launch platforms entered service. The shroud ring, which was a more permanent part of the torpedo, in turn solved most of the underwater stability issues. At the cost of a small amount of speed and range due to additional drag, it helped to stabilize the water flow past the propellers and rudders, and suddenly, almost every Mark 13 went exactly where it was aimed, almost no matter how high and how fast you dropped it. Which, of course, begs the question, how long did it actually take to fix? Well, thanks to the multiple breakthroughs all happening within a few months of each other, the Mark 13 was considered unreliable at best for around 2 years, only really starting to come good at the start of 1944, when the rush to fix the problem was so great that they even resorted to just making replacement tail assemblies which could be retrofitted onto existing torpedo stocks at sea, as well as the more conventional construct new torpedoes with the improvements already built in. Now, was the Mark 13 therefore bad, average, or good? Well, in the space of a few months from the end of 1943 to the start of 1944, the Mark 13 went from being frankly a terrible weapon whose awfulness was only really exceeded by the German-built aerial torpedoes, which themselves were so hopeless the Germans just gave up and bought Italian designs, to being, by late 1944, once everyone had gotten used to the high and fast launch profile, pretty much the best aerial torpedo on the planet. Now that brings us on to the Mark 14. Its background is a little bit simpler. The Mark 14 was developed to equip the newer submarines that were coming into service with the US fleet. Although there was a great drive for commonality in the interwar US Navy, it was accepted that to get the speed and firepower desired, a longer torpedo would be needed, and this would in turn be far too large to fit in the tubes found in older US submarines. And so it wasn't a replacement for the Mark 10 and a handful of modified Mark 9s that were in use on the R and S class submarines in the way that the Mark 13 was meant to replace the Mark 7, except that obviously the submarines the Mark 14 was designed for would themselves eventually replace the older submarines entirely in active service. To that end, its specification was such that, since it was to be carried in submarines rather than aircraft, the Mark 14 was a 21-inch diameter weapon that, in its basic form, came in at about 3,000 pounds in weight and was about 20.5 feet long. Some say 21 feet, depends exactly what parts of the torpedo you're measuring. Initially armed with approximately 500 pounds of TNT as a warhead and capable of speeds of up to 46 knots and ranges of up to 9,000 yards at slower speed settings, it was also equipped with the new all-singing, all-dancing Mark 6 exploder, which promised to incorporate both magnetic and contact detonation mechanisms, as well as other new technology in the torpedo that would allow for faster depth control and various other improvements. In terms of its introduction date, well, compared to the protracted development of the Mark 13, the Mark 14 practically sailed into service, being developed and deployed in the space of a couple of years at the start of the 1930s. But then, what were the problems? Well, several books, a large number of university theses, and swathes of articles have been written about the Mark 14's issues, and plenty of videos have been generated about the subject, including my own. Now, to ensure we aren't here for the next hour regaling you once more with the finer details of every single problem the Mark 14 had, these can broadly be divided into three primary categories, which annoyingly tended to mask each other, so solving one problem simply exposed another, which until that point hadn't necessarily been noticed. These three categories are depth control, the magnetic detonation option, and the contact detonation option. The reason that one concealed the other was that when a torpedo ran too deep, no one was particularly surprised if it failed to explode. But once you fixed the depth control, and it still didn't explode, well, the magnetic detonator came into question, and once you disabled that and set the torpedoes to run at a depth where contact would be made with the ship's hull, then, and only then, would submarine captains realize, well, the contact detonator was pretty junk as well. When it came to depth control, this issue actually had multiple causes. The most obvious one was that in the relatively rare test shots carried out before the war, due to the increasing demands for larger and larger warheads, plus a desire not to expend an expensive torpedo, the test shots were being done with inert torpedoes that were set to run deep under the target and then float to the surface due to the warhead being replaced with empty space. Somewhere along the line, it seems that somebody forgot to make the requisite adjustments for the true weight of the in-service warhead, and so the settings kept the lighter test shots at the necessary given depth, but then when applied to live torpedoes, they went sailing off into the deep blue below, well below the reach of even the magnetic detonator. Additionally, many test shots were done at lower accelerations than you would typically find when launching from a submarine, as well as at much shallower depths, since they tended to be done from test barges, which meant the initial conditions experienced by the torpedo systems simply weren't the same as the ones they'd faced when they were actually being launched. There were also issues with calibration. Theoretically, each torpedo needed to be calibrated and its specific characteristics noted in documents sent with it, since you couldn't guarantee that the weight, sensitivity, center of balance, and placement of equipment would be absolutely 100% identical in every single torpedo. Using these values, a submarine torpedo officer could make small changes on a per-weapon basis to compensate, but it seems that in at least some cases, generic calibration results were substituted for actual testing, and thus didn't actually reflect the performance of the particular torpedo in question. And finally, the devices aboard the torpedo that were used to sense depth had, in the interests of space and the new, more reactive control mechanisms, been moved. But it turned out their new location, at least the new location of the input sensors, was in an area of the torpedo's casing that experienced lower pressure than was actually the case for the depth in question, thanks to the way that water flowed over that part of the torpedo's body. This caused the torpedo to dive deeper until the pressure increased to a point where it thought it was at the correct depth, but was of course in fact far below where it should have been. Tank tests didn't help with this, because of course they showed the correct results as the torpedo was pretty much stationary, the pressure drop only occurring when the torpedo was moving at speed. Rather understandably, it would take some time to unpick all of these various causes. Next came the magnetic influence element of the Mark VI exploder. This had a problem that plagued virtually all magnetically detonated torpedoes at the start of World War II, namely the strength and direction of the Earth's magnetic field, which changes depending on your position relative to the poles and the equator. And so a detonator calibrated to work at Newport, which was where the US Navy developed its torpedoes, would function perfectly fine at or around that particular latitude. But if you moved closer to the equator, the field around a ship tends to spread out more horizontally and less vertically, as well as having a more gradual rate of change as you cross the various field lines. This, in turn, meant that a Mark 14 that was running under a ship's hull might not actually get close enough to the gradient of significant change in the magnetic field in order to cause it to detonate, which would result in a dud. And if the torpedo was set to run at a more shallow depth, then it would encounter the field significantly further out than expected and thus explode prematurely. Finally, once the magnetic influence portion of the exploder was disabled, it turned out that the contact detonator was, of course, also faulty, and this was because the exploder was set up in such a way that the firing pin was launched at 90 degrees to the direction of impact, which, when combined with the significantly increased force of said impact as a result of the Mark 14's higher speed compared to the older Mark 10, it meant that the guidance rods for the firing pin tended to bend under the sudden deceleration, which resulted in the firing pin head either jamming on the rods, or missing its exact impact zone, or coming in at a reduced speed, and in any case resulting in either a dud or a very low-order explosion. So what were the solutions? Well, for the depth setting issue, each individual element was relatively easily solved with new setting adjustments once people realized what was going on, or in the case of the sensors, they were just moved to where the pressure that they experienced was actually commensurate with the depth they were actually at. Fixing the Mark 6 exploder, on the other hand, was a much more difficult process. Not so much because the solutions weren't possible, but because of the intransigence of the Bureau of Ordnance. Now, that might seem somewhat odd, given their willingness to engage with the issues of the Mark 13 almost immediately. But the problems surrounding the Mark 14 had a few major differences compared to the aerial torpedo. Firstly, the Bureau of Ordnance appeared to have operated in very siloed teams, so the experience you had talking with one team didn't really have much of anything to do with how you'd be treated by another team. Secondly, one of the officers who'd led the Mark 6 exploder project in the first place, and believed it to be absolutely perfect in every possible way, was now a flag officer in the Southwest Pacific Theater and in the direct line of communication between the BUORD teams in the US and many of the submarines on the front line. He simply refused to believe that his work was anything other than perfect, and thus the crews who were using his perfect weapon were clearly using it wrongly. And this formed both a major roadblock and set something of a precedent for the attitude surrounding the system, at least initially, in that sector of the Bureau of Ordnance. Thirdly, the Mark 6 had been so secret, so heavily shrouded, that pre-war, a Mark 5 exploder had actually been in place on most Mark 14 torpedoes, which was just a Mark 6 with the magnetic influence mechanism taken out. In addition, the manual had been classified to such a degree that most of the men who were actually using the weapon weren't, at least at that point, even allowed to see the instruction manual for its use. And so exactly what might be going wrong with the exploder was knowledge that only a handful of people actually had, and they were on the wrong side of a communications line that was laden with various personal special interests. Now, to be fair, other nations, such as the UK and Germany, had also had issues with their magnetic influence detonators. The British had just removed them and switched back to contact fuses while they worked on fixing the problem. The Germans had tried to enact a series of corrective measures, including court-martialing several officers who were responsible for the problem in the first place. The initial measures they took were without much success, but they'd come around to the idea that it was the weapon's fault and not the crew's fault far, far faster than the Bureau of Ordnance in the US. Eventually, due to more so in-field testing and initiative at the front line by the various submarine crews than anything else, the magnetic influence aspect of the Mark 6 exploder was simply deactivated pending further investigation. And that, of course, left the contact element. At first, the only emergency solution was to fire the torpedoes to strike at an angle where the deceleration was less, while further work was carried out. This work took some rather interesting forms, including a number of warheads being hoisted on high and then dropped vertically onto steel plates, almost universally resulting in duds, including one amusing incident where the only damage that was caused to anything other than the torpedo head itself was when the Mark 6 exploder, which had jammed, flew out of the torpedo head on the moment of impact and smashed into some of the nearby equipment and sheds. In the end, the submarine crews got so frustrated they started working on their own solutions, And in the end, both the options that they developed and the Bureau of Ordnance's own thinking ended up being combined. So they ended up strengthening the guide rods and the firing spring and lightening the firing pin itself. That, at least, made the Mark VI Exploder's contact detonation feature workable. And of course, that only covers the three main areas where improvement was needed. There were a few other issues that in most other torpedoes would be viewed in and of themselves as somewhere between inconvenient and serious, but in the case of the Mark XIV, they tend to get swept up as footnotes to the much, much larger drama. Now, how long did it take to actually fix all this? Well, despite the intensely foot-dragging nature of this particular section of the Bureau of Ordnance, thanks in part to an intervention by Admiral King, and a circumvention of the normal chain of communication by Admiral Lockwood, and of course the increasingly madcap homemade tests and fixes by the submarine crews themselves, the Mark XIV was actually made largely serviceable, if only in the contact detonation role, by mid-1943, slightly ahead of the Mark XIII, reflecting a delay of just over a year and a half between the initial issues and a general resolution. So, does this leave the weapon bad, average, or good? Well, starting out as easily the least effective submarine-launched torpedo of World War II, the Mark XIV managed to claw its way back to usefulness. Although outperformed by a number of other torpedoes on both sides in terms of speed, range, and firepower, by the time it itself was actually working properly, it nonetheless remained a decent and serviceable weapon, and would continue to see service in one way, shape, or form well after the Second World War. And that, of course, leaves us with the Mark XV. So, its background was that it was developed in the mid-1930s to replace the Mark XI and Mark XII surface-launched torpedoes, and the Mark XV was the biggest of the family of three that we're considering today. It featured three different combinations of speed and range, and it was initially thought that the type might become a universal torpedo across the fleet. But unfortunately, this proved impossible. The range required for surface-launched torpedoes made it too long even for the extended tubes of the US fleet submarines. And the range requirements for both surface and submarine-launched weapons, coupled with a desire for a very large warhead, meant that the end result was far too heavy for the torpedo bombers of the 1930s and early 1940s to haul around either. Of the three torpedoes developed in the 1930s, though, the Mark XV was placed on something of a back burner as far as production was concerned. While a great many components were common between the Mark XIV and the Mark XV, it was anticipated that aircraft and submarines would expend far more torpedoes far sooner than the destroyers of the fleet would, since destroyers were the primary surface torpedo carriers of the US Navy. Thus, between this low priority, as well as the use of older Mark VIII torpedoes on some ships and modifications made to the Mark XI and Mark XII weapons to continue their usefulness somewhat, issues with the Mark XV initially didn't attract as much excitement as those found in the Marks XIII and XIV. In terms of specification, well, in its initial form, the Mark XV weighed in at just under 3,500 pounds, with a near 500-pound TNT warhead. It was, of course, 21 inches wide, almost 23 feet long, and it was capable of a top speed of about 45 knots at a range of 6,000 yards, dropping all the way down to 26 knots if you wanted to go 15,000 yards. Although that setting was very rarely used, and the intermediate setting of a 10,000-yard range at 33.5 knots was, along with the high-speed setting, far more commonly set when torpedoes were actually launched. It was introduced in 1935, and thus had over half a decade before the advent of World War II for the US with the attack on Pearl Harbor, to gradually percolate its way through the US destroyer fleet, as well as finding its way onto the torpedo tubes of the Atlanta-class cruisers. Now, in terms of problems, the Mark XV had some of the same problems as the Mark XIV. Apart from anything, they both used the Mark VI Exploder. But since the number of Mark XVs expended in the opening stages of the Pacific Campaign was far less than the number of Mark XIVs, and they tended to be expended in mad swirling battles where torpedoes that didn't explode would usually just be chalked up as misses, since no one was really paying all that much attention, At least compared to the careful monitoring that a submarine crew might carry out, what with all the gunfire and screaming that you had on the surface, the reported issues seemed, on paper at least, to be somewhat less. There were a few possible reasons for this being at least partly based in fact as well as perception. The Mark 15 was far more often fired at the medium speed setting compared to the Mark 14, which in turn would mean the contact detonator was more likely to work. The admiral who developed the Mark 6 exploder was in the Southwest Pacific submarine chain of command, and so the Central Pacific destroyers had probably never even heard of him, much less needed to pay any attention to what he said. So disabling the magnetic influencer was a much easier thing to accomplish. Additionally, the Mark 15 was far more likely to strike a maneuvering target, and thus the impact was more likely to be at an angle, once again lessening the impact force and increasing the chances of the contact detonator functioning properly. Destroyers were also far more likely to set their torpedoes to run at a depth that would ensure a contact hit with the hull, and thus torpedoes that went a little bit deep were probably still likely to detonate in some fashion, either by hitting further down on the target ship or maybe being close enough for the magnetic influencer to work. Although this would only save a certain number of slightly deeper diving torpedoes. Ones that went really deep would of course still be lost. And with that said, depth keeping was a persistent issue with the Mark 15s. Plus, the torpedo had its own unique problems. The low priority put on its production initially meant that when, suddenly, US destroyers started expending their torpedoes in job lots during the Guadalcanal and Solomons campaigns, there was a rather impressive shortage, which in turn resulted in a crash building program, which meant bringing in new and relatively inexperienced workers, and suddenly build quality issues began to plague the Mark 15. And then there was an attempt to save rare cadmium by plating the interior of the air flasks and other related components with zinc instead. Unfortunately, the zinc promptly oxidized and clogged the torpedo's drive systems. By the time all of these issues were resolved, and in some cases retro-engineered onto existing stock, the Mark 15 was finally starting to work as advertised, just in time for a rather significant lack of large Axis shipping targets and an increase in air attacks in general, and kamikazes in particular, seeing many ships landing some or all of their torpedo tubes in favour of more anti-aircraft guns, which now left a glut of Mark 15s where months earlier there hadn't been any to be found for love nor money. So, what were the solutions implemented? Well, the depth keeping and exploder issues were generally resolved roughly in parallel with those of the Mark 14, as they tended to be very similar, or in some cases identical. Although, thanks to some of the above-mentioned issues, the Mark 15 was generally viewed as at least somewhat reliable by mid-1943, which was slightly ahead of the other two torpedoes. The air flask issue had to be sorted by either stripping out the effective systems and then replacing them, with cadmium-lined ones, obviously, or coating the zinc with an experimental epoxy resin-type material. In terms of how long it actually took to fix them, well, the Mark 15 is the hardest of the three to pin down. Its reliability, while well below comparable weapons from other navies, was never quite as bad as that of the Mark 13 and the Mark 14, and as mentioned, it became somewhat more reliable about a year to a year and a half in, only then to be plunged partially back down again by the zinc issue. And so the Mark 15 was both the shortest and the longest to bring to some sort of serviceability of the three torpedoes. Now, did that leave it as a bad, average, or good weapon? Well, the Mark 15 tended to waver between below average and above average, trending towards good, depending on where it happened to be on its rather wobbly crisis timeline, as we've just discussed. Towards the end of the war, it was beginning to edge into the good territory, thanks to its Torpex warhead, but a number of other destroyer torpedoes on both sides were somewhat better. But its end would come about not so much because of its individual qualities, but simply because of the rather rapid demise of surface-launched anti-ship torpedoes on US warships generally, in favour of either missiles for the anti-shipping role, or specialist anti-submarine torpedoes, which tended to take up the place of the launchers. And so that's a brief summary of the main issues and fixes of the US's frontline torpedoes as per the start of World War II. Of course, when I get back to covering the next part of my US Pacific Fleet Submarine Campaign series, you will get to hear even more about the issues with the Mark 18, but that's for another time.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.